You. Have you ever heard of a country founded by another country's citizens? Not as conquerors, but as returning emigrants. That's the complicated story of Liberia. And at its heart is a controversial organization, the American Colonization Society. Buckle up, because this piece of history is a wild ride of mixed motives, good intentions, and devastating consequences. Let's rewind to 1816 in the United States. The country was grappling with the paradox of being a land of the free that still practiced slavery. In this tense climate, a group of prominent white Americans came together to form the American Colonization Society, or AX. Their goal: to resettle free African Americans in Africa. Now, this wasn't a simple, unified idea. The people involved had wildly different reasons for supporting it. On one side, you had genuine, though perhaps misguided, abolitionists. They looked at the rampant racism and discrimination faced by free black people in America and concluded they would never achieve true equality. Resettlement in Africa was a humanitarian solution, a chance for African Americans to build their own society, free from white oppression. But on the other side, you had a much more cynical group, slaveholders. They saw the growing population of free black people as a direct threat to the institution of slavery. Free African Americans were a living, breathing contradiction to the idea that black people were inherently suited for bondage. They inspired hope in those still enslaved and were often at the forefront of abolitionist movements. For slaveholders, sending free black people away was a way to secure their property and remove a disruptive element from society. So you have this strange alliance of people who hated slavery and people who wanted to protect it, all backing the same project. The founders of the ACS were a who's who of the American elite at the time. We're talking about figures like Henry Clay, a powerful senator and Speaker of the House, Bushrod Washington, a Supreme Court justice, and George Washington's nephew. And even Francis Scott Key, the man who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. With such influential backing, the ACS quickly gained momentum, securing private funding and even some support from the US government. The Society's first major action was to find a location for this new colony. They sent agents to West Africa, and in 1821, they controversially acquired a piece of land at Cape Mastordo. I say controversially because the deal was made with local leaders under duress, involving a US naval officer pointing a pistol at a chief's head to force the sale. This troubled beginning was a sign of the complex and often coercive relationships that would define the new colony. In 1822, the first group of settlers arrived. These were free-born African Americans and formerly enslaved people who had gained their freedom. They landed in a challenging new environment, facing unfamiliar diseases, difficult terrain, and resistance from indigenous groups who saw them as foreign intruders. The settlement they established was named Monrovia, in honor of US President James Monroe, and the colony itself was called Liberia, from the Latin word liber, meaning free. For the next 2 decades, the ACS essentially governed Liberia. They were the ones organizing the ships that brought over thousands of settlers who would come to be known as Americo-Liberians. The AX controlled everything: land distribution, trade, law enforcement, and administration. They appointed the colonial agents, all of whom were white, to run the colony. The Society's vision for Liberia was a carbon copy of the United States, but without the institution of slavery. David introduced a legal system based on American law and a political structure that mirrored the American Republic. A constitution was drafted, heavily inspired by the US Constitution. English became the official language, and Western-style education and Christianity were heavily promoted. The ACS saw this as a civilizing mission. They believed they were bringing progress and enlightenment to Africa. However, this perspective completely ignored and devalued the rich and complex cultures, traditions, and political systems of the 16 major indigenous groups already living in the region. For the Americo-Liberian settlers, adopting these American norms was a way to distinguish themselves from the local populations. Having just escaped a society where they were at the bottom of the social ladder, they created a new hierarchy in Liberia, with themselves at the top. This created a deep and lasting social divide. The Americo-Liberians, who've never made up more than a small percentage of the total population, consolidated political and economic power. They controlled the government, the best land, and the most profitable trade routes. The indigenous majority, on the other hand, was largely excluded from power, denied citizenship rights for many years, and often subjected to forced labor and taxation. They were treated as subjects, not as fellow citizens. By the 1840s, the ACS was running into financial trouble. Managing a colony from across an ocean was expensive and difficult. At the same time, the settlers in Liberia were growing more independent and eager to rule themselves. They also needed international recognition as a sovereign nation to manage trade and diplomacy, especially with the British, who were active in the region. So, in 1847, with the encouragement of the ACS, the Americo-Liberian leaders declared Liberia an independent republic, the very first one in Africa. The society's official role was over, but its legacy was deeply embedded in the new nation's fabric. The long-term impact of the American Colonization Society is profoundly complex. On one hand, it did facilitate the creation of a nation that became a symbol of Black independence. Liberia provided a home for thousands of African Americans seeking freedom and self-determination. It was a beacon of hope in an era of widespread colonialism. However, the acts also planted the seeds of future conflict. The social and political structure it established created a caste system, with a ruling Americo-Liberian elite and a disenfranchised indigenous majority. This deep-seated inequality and resentment simmered for over a century. It created a society that was, in many ways, as stratified and unequal as the one the settlers had left behind in America. These tensions eventually boiled over. 1980, a military coup led by Samuel Doe, an indigenous Crown man, overthrew the Americo-Liberian government, ending 133 years of their rule. This event was followed by years of political instability and, ultimately, two devastating civil wars that ravaged the country from 1989 to 2003. Many historians and political analysts trace the root causes of this conflict directly back to the foundational divisions established during the colonial period under the ACS. So, the story of the American Colonization Society and Liberia is a cautionary tale. It shows how ideas born from a mix of genuine compassion and deep-seated prejudice can lead to unintended and tragic outcomes. It was an ambitious social experiment that created Africa's first republic, but also built a legacy of division and conflict that the nation is still working to overcome today. It reminds us that history is rarely black and white, and the road to freedom is often more complicated than we can imagine. 2. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a fascinating and crucial chapter of history. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that shape our world. See you next time!